When it comes to retro handheld consoles, ANBERNIC has been churning out devices faster than you can say, game over. Every few months, a new one hits the market, with just enough tweaks to make you feel like you're missing out if you don't upgrade. Their latest offering, the ANBERNIC RG40XX V, is no exception. But is it really worth adding to your collection? Or is this just another flash in the pixelated pan? Spoiler alert, it's not exactly a Game Boy killer. If you are excited as we are about today's topic, show some love by liking and subscribing to Retro Pocket for more amazing content. ANBERNIC's obsession with quantity over quality. Let's get one thing straight. ANBERNIC has made some great handhelds in the past. The RG35XX and the RG351V were absolute hits when they first launched, and I remember being genuinely excited about them. Fast forward to today, and ANBERNIC is sticking to a familiar playbook: release as many consoles as possible, with tiny improvements that are supposed to make you feel like you've got to catch them all. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's a bit like Pokemon, but instead of collecting rare monsters, you're just amassing a bunch of handhelds that do pretty much the same thing. The RG40XX V is the vertical version of the RG40XX and while it offers a new form factor, it feels like the same old song and dance. Sure, it's priced competitively at around $67, which might make it appealing to budget-conscious gamers. But when you look past the price tag, you start to see the cracks. The device still struggles with the same issues that ANBERNIC hasn't addressed for years. It's like they're saying, hey, we'll keep making these as long as you keep buying them, without ever really listening to the community's feedback. Honestly, by the time I finished this review, they had already announced another handheld. It's becoming impossible to keep up. At this point, I feel like I'm reviewing the same device over and over again, just with a slightly different shell. Design and build quality, close but no cigar. Let's start with the design, because this is probably the most redeeming feature of the RG40XX V. It's got a 4-inch IPS display with a 4:3 aspect ratio and a resolution of 640 by 480. The screen is one of the best things about this console, hands down. The colors pop, the brightness is solid, and it's just big enough to make gaming enjoyable without feeling cramped. It's a half-inch bigger than some of their other handhelds, but that small change does make a noticeable difference. The glass display adds a touch of class too, giving it a slightly more modern look compared to some of its retro competitors. But that's where the praise ends, because once you get past the screen, things start to fall apart. Let's talk buttons. If you've seen my other ANBERNIC reviews, you know I'm a fan of their D-pads. They're usually solid, reliable, and smooth to the touch. The RG40XX V keeps that trend going. However, the high-gloss action buttons, not a fan. They feel cheap, and the font choice is just plain boring. It's like they slapped them on at the last minute. And what's with the weird circles engraved around the buttons? It looks like an afterthought, and once you notice them, you can't unsee them. It feels like ANBERNIC could have done something more interesting here, but instead, they just went with meh. Oh, and let's not forget the select button getting stuck under the shell. I thought this was just a fluke with my unit, but after testing a second device, it happened again. I guess sticky buttons are part of the experience now? The misplaced analog stick, awkward meets confused. One of the biggest head-scratchers for me is the lone analog stick. It's just kind of there, like a lost puppy waiting for someone to pay attention to it. To be fair, it's a Hall effect joystick with LED lights, so it's got some cool factor. But the placement? Not so much. The joystick doesn't have a ton of travel because of the LED ring around it, which makes it feel like a missed opportunity. It's like getting a brand new car, but finding out the steering wheel only turns halfway. Oh, and let's talk about the speaker placement. ANBERNIC decided to put the speaker grill right under your thumb. Genius, right? Nothing like muffling your own sound while you're trying to get through a boss fight. The sound quality is decent for a single speaker, but the placement is just no. Ergonomics. Almost there, but not quite. No. Flipping the console over, you've got the shoulder buttons, which are actually one of the few things that seem to improve with each ANBERNIC release. The L2R2 buttons are raised just enough to be easily distinguished, and they sit close to the internal contacts, meaning you don't have to press down hard to activate them. They're okay, but they're still far from perfect. Overall, the device feels sturdy in your hands. The plastic shell is scratch-resistant, which is a nice touch. The buttons are generally well placed, apart from that awkward analog stick, making the RG40XX V fairly comfortable to use for extended gaming sessions. But comfort doesn't excuse mediocrity. User experience and firmware, as fun as watching paint dry. Now we get to the real Achilles heel of this device: The user experience. Turning on the RG40XX V greets you with the same old ANBERNIC front end that feels like it was designed on a Windows 98 PC. It's dull, awkward to navigate, and just plain uninspired. Sure, it does the job, but at what cost? The cost is boredom. I've said this in every ANBERNIC review, but it bears repeating. They really need to invest in a better user interface. Instead, they rely on the community to do the heavy lifting by downloading custom firmware. And while I understand the DIY appeal, it's frustrating that ANBERNIC keeps pumping out new devices without ever improving the software experience. For emulation, the device uses RA Game, RetroArch, which is fine, but the menu system is clunky and confusing for newbies. It's not rocket science, but it feels like it could be a lot smoother. Emulation performance. Good, but far from great. So how does the RG40XX V perform when it comes to emulation? In short, pretty well, up to a point. It can handle NES, SNES, Game Boy Advance, Game Gear, and Mega Drive games like a champ. These titles run flawlessly, and they look fantastic on that crisp 4-inch display. Seriously, the screen is the star of the show here. But when you start pushing the limits with Dreamcast and Nintendo 64 games, things start to get a bit shaky. Most of these games run well, but you'll notice occasional performance drops on more demanding titles. If you're looking to play PSP, PS2, or GameCube games, don't bother. This console just doesn't have the horsepower for it, and honestly, the 4-inch screen doesn't lend itself well to those systems anyway. I tried running PSP games and the experience was pretty dismal. Frame rates dropped faster than my enthusiasm for this device. So if you're hoping to use the RG40XX V for anything beyond Dreamcast and N64, you're out of luck. At the end of the day, the ANBERNIC RG40XX V is another decent but not exceptional handheld in a sea of similar devices. Yes, it's affordable, and yes, it has a gorgeous screen. But those features alone aren't enough to save it from being just another meh console that's more of the same. The sticky buttons, awkward joystick placement, outdated user interface, and lackluster emulation performance for anything beyond Dreamcast and N64 hold this device back from greatness. It's like ANBERNIC is content with making small, incremental improvements instead of truly innovating. If you're in the market for a budget vertical handheld, the RG40XX V is fine. But if you're looking for something that will genuinely impress you, you might want to look elsewhere. ANBERNIC's obsession with quantity over quality is starting to wear thin, and the RG40XX V is proof of that. In the end, this device isn't bad, it's just not exciting. And in a world where retro handhelds are popping up left and right, not exciting just doesn't cut it anymore. It's time for ANBERNIC to stop playing it safe and start giving us something truly innovative. Hit that like button if you found this helpful. Show your support by liking and subscribing. Let's reach 10,000 subscribers together.